Right. Okay. We'll make a start. And obviously, first of all, thank you to everyone turning up this morning for the session that we're hosting alongside the ICAEW on apprenticeships. And obviously, it's a very good time to be having this kind of session with lots of firms thinking about recruitment if they've not already recruited, but also thinking about different routes that they can put their new recruits down starting this autumn. And obviously, doing it under an apprenticeship with ICAEW is one of those routes we're going to be looking at today. So my name is Ian Fidock, and I'm the managing director of First Intuition Maidstone, and I'm joined today by Shane Reeves, who's my head of apprenticeships, and also with Frank Garvey, who is our regional business development manager for the ICAEW. Next slide, please, Shane. It's not lots of curves and panicking about cases. That's good. So, First Intuition. Now, obviously, lots of names and faces on this webinar I recognise. But for those of you that aren't using us or haven't used us for a while, it's quite good just to kind of refresh our memories of why First Intuition is the place to be sending your students for their professional qualifications and to do potentially an apprenticeship with us. The key thing about working with First Intuition is we want to very much build relationships with our clients and with our students. And that's very important with an apprenticeship in particular, because we've got to make sure that that apprenticeship program meets the needs of the employer and the student. Okay, all three of us, the training provider, the employer, the student, we need to be working together on that program. And when it comes to things like the development of skills and behaviours that I'm sure Shane's going to be talking about shortly, we've got to make sure that those skills, behaviours are ones that are of benefit and can be developed in the workplace. So as well as the kind of the knowledge that they gather when they come on their professional courses with us, there's also that development of skills and behaviours in the workplace, making sure they're tying in with your needs as an employer. Obviously, we're an owner-managed business. But we are part of a bigger FI national network. So obviously being part of that national network helps us to share best practice. It also means that First Intuition is represented on things like trailblazer groups when they're discussing the future of apprenticeship standards, looking at funding levels. But at a local level, we do make decisions at a local level. So again, we're always thinking about making sure what we're offering and what we're doing is meeting the needs of our clients and of the students of those clients. And it's that kind of relationship with students that's also, and employers, is also very, very much a tick in the box of Ofsted. So obviously, as we say, use government money to provide apprenticeships, we're subject to Ofsted like a school is, and they're very much looking at the way we work with our local communities, our local employers, to make sure that we're able to offer apprenticeships that meets those needs. Obviously, our core focus is accountancy and tax courses. So ICAEW, obviously, AAT, ACCA. But linking into that, we've also recently launched, actually last autumn, and we've got another cohort this autumn, apprenticeships in leadership and management. And there is that connection there. I've experienced it personally. I'm sure some of you on this call have experienced it, where you qualify as an accountant, and then it's almost just because of time and the fact you've qualified, you end up becoming what we call an accidental manager. So you just kind of start to manage and just pick it up without any actual kind of formal training as such or qualification that goes with it. So we've launched level 3 and level 5 leadership and management apprenticeships. So again, just extending our product range, and say something that we understand from clients is a useful tool for them to have as well. Next slide, please, Shane. So across the whole FI network, as you can see, we have a lot of learners, and a great percentage, and an ever increasing percentage of those are going down an apprenticeship route. In Maidstone specifically, I think we have about 600 to 700 learners, of which about 160, 170 are apprentices, and about 55% of those are doing a level 7 apprenticeship. And so that's where ICAEW would come in. And that number is increasing. When we're thinking about year on year and looking at, let's say, historically September starts, more and more firms are looking and using apprenticeship funding to support their training. So it's something that's just going to continue to increase. It was only back on the 1st of July that we celebrated 10 years of being in Maidstone as First Intuition. Obviously, lots of us had been with a previous provider for years before that. In actual fact, myself in Maidstone doing this job, it's now been 20 years, and I don't look that old. But obviously that experience, that's why we have fantastic pass rates. So last week we had ICAEW pass rates out. This week it's ACCA pass rates. And at the moment, as we're collating that information, again, we're exceeding national averages across all the papers, which is excellent. And that's because of our tuition, the materials, the work of the students, and bearing in mind that's been through a very difficult time when lots of our courses have been hybrid courses, where students have been some in the classroom, but also some watching from home and doing it virtually. So it's been a very difficult time. So to see fantastic pass rates and students still getting through has been really, really good to see. Class size wise, obviously we are the only provider in Maidstone. In actual fact, in Kent, lots of local colleges do offer AAT, etc. But in terms of level 7 apprenticeships, I think you'll find we're the only provider in Kent of this. So we do have to manage our class sizes very carefully. And again, if you think about Ofsted coming along, and Ofsted, when they do their inspections, they observe our classes to see the quality of our tuition, to make sure that that learning is taking place. We can't have a class of 40-odd students sitting there. Yeah, that's not very good. It's not a very good learning experience. So what we do, particularly for AAT more than ICAEW, because of the numbers, we are actually doubling up on classes so we can get those numbers down to make it a better learning experience, and where we can give that attention to those students that need it more. So that class size management is very important to us. And talking about excellent tuition, and what goes along with that is the support that our tutors provide as well. Okay, probably more than ever before over the past 18 months or so now, we have had students that have needed that extra support where they've been studying online or doing it virtually rather than coming into the classroom. And so lots of our tutors have been doing one-to-one sessions. There's a lot more submission of questions to be marked because students are a bit more nervous about how they're going to do in the exams. But that's what we stand for. Our open door policy means that our tutors are there to provide that support as and when it's required. Next slide, please, Shane. Now, a couple of things to say here. And, clients and locations, all relatively big names. I mean, in Maidstone, the likes of Assets, MHA, Creston Reeves, big names. But it's very important to remember that it's not just big firms that can take advantage of apprenticeship funding. Those firms are kind of what are called levy paying firms. Non-levy paying firms, we've got lots of those, say, smaller businesses that are taking advantage of apprenticeship funding as well. And the reason they're taking advantage of it, and there's actually kind of two reasons. It's very, very easy to think about the financial benefits and saying, brilliant, as a non-levy payer, we only have to pay 5%, and then the rest of it comes from the government. And obviously, because that's government money, public money, if you like, that's why we've got to make sure that we are delivering and meeting the standards required of Ofsted. But it's not just about the financials, and it's very easy to be kind of misled by that. Doing an apprenticeship program will lead to a more rounded, better apprentice at the end of it. So rather than just somebody that comes out and says, brilliant, I've passed all these papers, because of the skills and behaviors that they develop as well, which are kind of tracked and monitored through the apprenticeship, they come out at the end as a more valuable employee for you and your firms. And so apprenticeships, and I always talk about this, as apprenticeships being able to offer firms several things. Number one, recruitment. I know I've spoken to recruitment agents in the area, and they're saying that there aren't that many candidates about. There's lots of opportunities, but they're struggling to find the candidates. Now, I know that's always potentially been a problem in Kent because you've had the draw of London. So if you've got an apprenticeship program and you're advertising and promoting that structured program that gives them a more rounded package, that potentially puts you ahead when it comes to recruitment, sets you aside from other competitors that just say, oh, we'll support your training, but showing that apprenticeship program, showing how you're going to do more than just the professional qualification and develop those additional skills and behaviours. To retain them. So you'd like to think, and again, I know it varies from business to business, but one of the things, again, we struggle with potentially in Kent is you put a student through the qualification, they qualify, they get touched up, so to speak, by a recruitment agent, and before you know it, they're off somewhere else, usually into London, the bright lights, the big money. Whereas if, again, you've shown that commitment to their training, yeah, you've invested in them, you'd like to think that potentially at the end, you get that bit more of a commitment. And there you've got your managers, your partners of the future. So it kind of acts at both the start and the end of their career. So non-levy firms, they should be aware that there are benefits to them as well. This isn't just for your big, your big players. Non-levy firms can take advantage, and they're structured. They are set up to help with the development as well. And that's something that Shane and Frank will talk about, how you might be aware that you can support apprentices, even though you might think you're relatively small. As I've said at the very start, FI is a national network. Obviously, the Maidstone office is where we are, but we are starting to run courses at the start, AAT courses from Canterbury. And again, that's just to cater for a part of the market that we're not fully tapping into. And also looking at, say, something again that Ofsted likes to see, not only kind of our relationship with employers and the community, but also how we can support recruitment in inverted commas, maybe more deprived areas. So in Kent, thinking about Thanet and those kind of areas. So Canterbury is something that we're opening up in September, starting off with AAT. So that's what I have to say about this just opening piece. It's really just to talk about how apprenticeships, I say, are growing, how you can use them to your advantage, but it is being aware it's not just the financial benefit, because as I say, it is public money. There are requirements, but it's well worth doing those additional requirements because of hopefully the benefit you then get from your employee as they go through the program. So I'm now going to pass over to Shane to talk in a bit more detail about what that program looks like. Thank you, Shane.
Oh, thanks, Ian. Morning, everyone. So for anybody that wasn't here at the start, my name's Shane and I'm the Head of Apprenticeships at FI Maidstone. So over these next few slides then, I'm just going to talk you through, I suppose, who's eligible for an apprenticeship and really what's involved and what our apprenticeship programs look like. I'm primarily going to focus today, for reasons that are probably obvious with Frank here, on the ICAEW and the Level 7 apprenticeships. And then I'm going to hand over to Frank to talk through the structure of the ICAEW and exactly what goes within the apprenticeships at that level. I'm more than happy for people to shout out any questions. I've managed to get the chat box up now, so feel free to type them through if you've got anything that you want to ask as we go through. But to start with, quite often the biggest question I'm asked is, I suppose, who can do an apprenticeship, and that myth around it's always needed to be school leavers or people that have just new to the industry, have no prior experience. And actually that's not the case. I mean, these slides give you the key requirements, if you like. They need to be in a relevant job role. So obviously not somebody that isn't in accounting, basically, if you want them to do an accounting role, apprenticeship. They need to be aged between 16 and 99. I'm not sure why they've excluded 100, but yeah, anybody up to the age of 99 can do an apprenticeship. And they need to have been a citizen of a country, either the UK or within the EEA, for at least the previous 3 years. So those are some of the key requirements. The bottom two on this slide, it's worth noting, particularly with level 7s, that they can't be receiving any other government funding. So being careful of anybody that might be studying for a degree, potentially, particularly if they're doing it part-time, they can't do both at the same time. And the other thing we come across quite a lot at level 7 is those that just need the technical element. So they just want the ICAEW qualification, actually from a skills and behaviour, softer skill workplace perspective, they're already quite competent. All apprentices need to have room for development across the board. So they need to have room for development in those softer skills, workplace skills and behaviours as well. Again, a lot easier if you've got somebody that's a school leaver with no prior experience, but just something to bear in mind if you're taking on somebody potentially that has been with you a little while, but you're looking to upskill or promote potentially. I will send these slides out after as well. So yeah, I appreciate it can be a little bit deaf like PowerPoint webinars, but I will send them out after the event. So this slide looks at, I suppose, the differences between doing it as an apprenticeship versus exam only. So we offer apprenticeships at level 3, 4 and 7 with accounting. And you can do those obviously as a standalone professional qualification as well. The levels 3 and 4 traditionally are done with AAT. However, you can do level 4 with the ICAEW CFAB route as well. And that tends to be quite popular for people that are school leavers, but where the employer wants them to go straight down the ICAEW route rather than starting with AAT. And then at level 7 is where you would traditionally fit in that ICAEW qualification. The key difference is if you are pulling somebody on apprenticeship route is, as I mentioned a minute ago, those skills and the behaviours. So making sure that it's not only focused on the technical knowledge and passing of the exams, that they are going to be developing skills and behaviours that have been agreed and set out by the government and employers. So these are industry-wide, almost like learning objectives, if you like, that all apprentices have to develop against. The other thing to bear in mind is that all apprentices have to do an endpoint assessment. So at the end of their apprenticeship, they are externally assessed by the ICAEW in this instance, and that's to check their competency against the...
I know. Oh, the garden one, yeah.
Just going to put everybody on mute, sorry. That's to check their competency against the learning objectives within the apprenticeship. So it's almost like we can't mark our own homework, basically. But pleased to say that so far, our success rates for endpoint assessments are absolutely fine. Nobody has failed this to date. It's not a challenge and not something I want to change now either. And the final element, which I'm going to go into in slightly more detail in a minute, but is probably the biggest consideration for you guys as employers, is what's known as 20% off the job training. So it's a government requirement that all apprentices have to spend 20% of their contracted hours over the duration of the apprenticeship on some form of new learning or development that is relevant to the apprenticeship they're doing. But if I'm honest, the actual title of it is a little bit misleading because it suggests you have to give them a day off a week. And that's not actually the case. What the government didn't want is a load of people being taken on as cheap labour and asked to scan for a year without gaining any form of knowledge. And I'm going to come on to in a minute the types of things that you can include within that 20%, which will hopefully alleviate people's fears. But it doesn't mean that you have to give them a day off a week, is all I would say at this point. Looking at the structure of an apprenticeship then, and I've tried to keep this quite simplistic because apprenticeships can be a little bit of a minefield. We tend to look at it in 3 phases. So the first phase is what we call the on-programme learning, and apprenticeships are split out into what's known as knowledge, skills and behaviours. So the knowledge is the technical elements that they'll need to learn, and that's all covered by the professional qualification courses. The skills and the behaviours are those softer skills workplace learning objectives that it's deemed a fully qualified accountant would need to be competent within their role. And to deliver those, that's through a combination of work experience, workplace development, but also skills days as well that we run in centre, and I will come back to those. But we support that on-programme element. So all apprentices have obviously their tutors that teach their knowledge elements, and then they're allocated a skills and a development coach as well, who will work with them throughout the programme, primarily focusing on the skills and the behaviours, but are there to check they're on track, provide any support, and equally act as that first point of contact. So if the students do have any questions or concerns, they've got somebody that's named that they can go straight to. And that links very much back into what Ian mentioned earlier around the structure that an apprenticeship provides, really. Once an apprentice has done all of their learning, they then enter the final two phases. So the middle one, if you like, is what's known as the gateway. And this is basically where the training provider, apprentice and employer have to agree that the learner is competent against all of the knowledge, skills and behaviours. It's a bit of a non-event. If I'm honest, it comes at the end of the learning phase. It's planned when that should be at the start. And generally you wouldn't get to a gateway meeting if everybody wasn't in agreement that the learner's competent. Otherwise it's a bit of a waste of a meeting, but it is a sign off, if you like. And then you come on to that endpoint assessment at the end, which for ICAEW at level 7 involves the final case study exam and then a project report based on the skills and behaviour development that the apprentice has been doing. And we will support their preparation for the endpoint assessment in all elements as well. So they're not left to fend for themselves on that. We run workshops, and obviously the case study exam is a fully structured course like all of the other ICAEW courses. So hopefully that gives you guys a little bit of an idea of the structure. I'm not going to touch a huge amount on classroom courses today because Ian's done some of that for me. But as Ian mentioned earlier, the classroom courses will involve the tutor support. They will get all of the study materials that they need and access to the course and mock exams, which are particularly important at level 7 to monitor and test that progress as you go through. They also get access to online materials for those of you that haven't worked with us before, as well as any paper materials that may be provided, although a lot of the ICAEW ones have gone online as a result of changes at that end as well. But I mentioned earlier around the Impact Skills programme and skills days that we run, and this links into the development of those skills and behaviours. So rather than giving learners lots and lots of workbook activities to try and fulfil those skills development, we've turned them into workshops, one-day workshops that focus on some of the key areas that I suppose accountants are going to need in this day and age. And what this slide shows you are the different modules that are basically available. Now we split them into different levels to try and look at those that are potentially new to the world of work or to accounting, or those that may be doing a level 3 or 4. We've got the advanced level for those that potentially aren't quite as new or doing a level 7. And then all level 7s also do a professional development course in their final year that looks at the skills required to go on and sort of that strategic direction, if you like, into the future. Now, I'm not going to bore everybody and go through the ins and outs of each one of these today, but when setting up a program with employers, we discuss the ones that are relevant for you guys. We look at the level they're doing, and obviously are happy to tweak these around business needs, if you like. So if there's any on here where you go, this would be really beneficial, then we can work with you to do that. But these workshops are a practical way for the learner to get experience in the skill behaviour that it's covering, and then I suppose a safe place to practice it without having to complete lots of written work or just be thrown in at work in the deep end, with the intention that they go away from the day able to apply this with yourselves and you then notice a tangible difference, really. The other element that I spoke about was the skills and the development coach that all apprentices will get. So as I said, the role of that coach really is a support element primarily, and they would undertake quarterly progress reviews, so 12 weekly progress reviews with the learner. And we also involve the line managers in that as well. So where Ian mentioned earlier around that employer collaboration, we get employers involved because you know best what's coming up next, if you like, for the next 12 weeks. But they're able to monitor that progression. So if a learner's falling behind, we can intervene early. And support around, personal welfare, exam stress, career development, particularly at level 7 and ICAEW. As you guys know, there are a lot of exams involved, and conscious of not underestimating the stress that can put on learners, particularly those that aren't used to this level of intensity as well. So that again falls into the role of the coach. And they would start that support in building up the evidence required for the endpoint assessment. So they're there to help support with a project report alongside a tutor as well. And then the final element of the, I suppose, well, not the final element, but the key element of the learner experience is around the 20% off the job that I touched upon earlier. Now, I've tried to give a bit of an indication here of standard durations at each level, and then how many days would be required to meet the 20% off the job. And this is based on a 35-hour contracted week. So I'm well aware that that might fluctuate depending on your contracted hours. But if we just look at the level 7 column to start with, you can see that roughly, with no exemptions, it's a 3-year course. And that equates to approximately 140 days of 20% required, which sounds horrific, but actually when you spread that out over the 3 years, isn't as bad as it probably looks as a headline, particularly with the way the courses are structured with ICAEW, in that 126 of those days would be covered by ICAEW courses anyway. So the tuition and revision courses that they would attend with us. So from that perspective, if you were looking for them to study a classroom course regardless, you're probably not losing out. You've only got roughly another 14 days required, of which 7 of those would come from the Impact Skills programme anyway. It's worth noting at this point, pretty much anything that you can say is relevant to the apprenticeship and the apprentice has genuinely learned something from would probably count. So any form of new task they do at work, as long as it is new and they've learned something, would count towards the 20%. Any shadowing or mentoring they do counts. Might be secondments, could be observations of other departments. Again, that would all count. And more obvious stuff being any study leave you decide to offer the apprentice on top of classroom courses counts as well. So it's really difficult at this stage, I suppose, to give a definitive, this is everything that counts and this is everything that doesn't. But the easiest way of looking at it is, as long as the apprentice has room for development and you're able to provide the opportunities for them to develop, the chances of meeting the 20%, most people go well above it. The hardest bit is actually logging it, if I'm honest, because that's the tedious bit. However, there are a few things that are just pretty much don't count, and it is worth bearing that in mind. The first one I put on this list is a bit of a grey area when it comes to internal training. It depends on the internal training. Okay, so just being careful of some internal training courses are not relevant to the apprenticeship, aren't relevant to accounting and therefore can't be included. But the more obvious ones, such as money laundering, anti-money laundering, sorry, that might be a webinar, that sort of thing, obviously can count. Any induction programs where the apprentice isn't learning anything that is relevant to the apprenticeship can't be included. So a lot of inductions count, but there are elements of it where there's actually no new learning relevant to the apprenticeship, and obviously you wouldn't be able to count those. Progress reviews sadly don't count because they are more of a reflection on what the apprentice has already learned as opposed to what they're learning in that moment. And then any training out of working hours. So we're well aware and we'd expect all the apprentices to continue studying beyond any study leave you guys might provide. But if they're doing that of an evening or a weekend, that doesn't count towards 20%. So there are, I suppose, some definitives that are definite no-nos. But I would just say that that shouldn't be a barrier generally if the other criteria around being able to provide those opportunities are met. I'll just pause at this point and ask whether anybody's got any questions on the 20%, because this can sometimes be the area where I get most questions. It's obviously fine if not. Cool. Okay. If anybody thinks of anything, feel free to type it in and I'll come back to it. So that is a very brief overview of the learner experience, but not wanting to bore anybody on a Wednesday morning. That gives you the key headlines. I'm now going to move on to the funding element that comes with apprenticeships. And I have focused this on primarily non-levy paying employers, because for levy, it's quite straightforward because you have to pay the tax regardless. But in terms of what you can include in the funding, all of the training courses, all of the materials, the support we provide, the skills and the development coach, that is all included. Okay, so there's no additional costs on top there. It includes the first sitting of the endpoint assessment, so that's not an additional cost to the employer. And it includes any progress reviews, administrative costs that we incur. That will come through on the government funding. There are a couple of areas, however, that you can't include in the funding, which is probably the most important for you guys. The first one being exam fees, because ironically, the qualification is non-mandatory within the apprenticeship. Feedback to the government, not with me on that one. We're not allowed to include exam fees within the funding band. So those fees would need to be paid for by the employer. We also can't include any registration or membership fees in the funding band. So again, that would be a cost that the employer would need to pay. And this one doesn't come up very often, but things like salary, wages, travel expenses, that's all the cost that sits with the employer. You can't include that within the funding either. It is worth saying as well that resits of exams, or if they needed to resit an element of the EPA, wouldn't be able to be included within that funding. But beyond that, everything else can be. The key thing it is important for employers to be aware of, however, is that apprentices can't be asked to contribute to the cost of their training in any way. So traditionally, training contracts have potentially had clawbacks and that sort of thing. You're not allowed to do that if you are employing somebody as an apprentice. It's not to say you can't have training contracts that put a limit on the number of exam attempts before you look at contractual matters potentially, but you're not allowed to charge the apprentice for anything. So in terms of how the funding works for non-levy paying employers, so for those of you that don't know, you're non-levy if you have a wage bill of less than 3 million annually, basically. And if you sit within that bracket, then we would agree a cost for the apprenticeship before your apprentice starts. Now, the funding band for level 7 is 21,000, and as standard, our apprenticeships don't exceed that unless we extend the duration or add any additional units in. Of that 21,000 or less, if the price is lower, the government will pay 95% of that price, with the employer paying the remaining 5%. It's worth noting if you go over the funding band, so if we have added additional units or if your duration is slightly longer, they won't fund anything above the 21,000. Okay, so that would then be liable to the employer. To claim the funding, you do need to have set your company up on the apprenticeship service. For anybody that hasn't done it, I'll send a link round. It's quite generic. I'm told it only takes 5 minutes. Haven't done it myself in a while, but I believe it is quite straightforward. You just need your PAYE number to set that up, and that will allow you to reserve funding. I've realised I've got an out-of-date slide here as well, because I've put that the funding is currently limited to 3 starts. It isn't. It's limited to 10 starts at the moment. So at any one time, as a non-levy employer, you're allowed 10 apprentices that are live, basically. So once you get somebody complete, you get one back, and so on and so forth. There is a lot of lobbying going on to try and increase that limit, because a lot of employers have met that threshold, particularly when you look at level 7, which is potentially 3 or 4 years. If you've got an intake every year, it wouldn't take you very long to potentially reach 10. So there is discussions going on. The government did reset the limit this year, so everybody got reset to 0, but it is in the hands of the government on that one. And then the co-investment or top-up fee is paid up front. So that's a cost that the employer would pay at the start of the programme. If you are a levy-paying employer, it's actually far simpler in that you automatically every month pay a certain percentage of your wage bill into a levy pot. And you can use that pot on apprenticeship funding in exactly the same way that I've said what can and can't be funded on this slide. But there is no 5% that you have to pay up front or reserving funding that's required, because you're in effect being taxed on it already as you go through. But some good news, now that I've done the bad news and how much it's going to cost you, is some of the incentives that are currently in place by the government. So with COVID, the Chancellor has been obviously throwing a lot of money about, and some of that has gone in the direction of apprenticeships. So the government is currently paying employers £3,000 per apprentice for anyone that's hired between the 1st of April and 30th of September 2021. Now, this needs to be an employment contract start date between those dates. Okay, not an apprenticeship start date necessarily. You get a couple of extra months to start the apprenticeship afterwards. It's got to be a new employee, and they can't previously have been employed with you. What they don't want is people firing and rehiring, obviously, to get the incentive. And if you had somebody that joined prior to the 1st of April, that doesn't make you ineligible. There were other incentives available prior to that date, but this is the current new one, if you like, that is COVID related. There is also no limit on the number of times they will pay that out. So if you did hire all 10 within the next, what we in end of July, you would get the full amount there. They don't cap it or anything like that. If you employ somebody that is 16 to 18, and this is not a COVID related incentive, so this is always on the go, then you're entitled to a £1,000 incentive payment as well. So this is in addition to any other incentives, and it's paid in 2 instalments, one after 90 days and one after 365 days. It does also apply to anybody that's aged 19 to 25 who has an educational health and care plan in place as well. So just worth bearing that one in mind. And then the final one is if your apprentice is aged 16 to 18 at the start of their programme and you've got less than 50 employees, you may be exempt from the 5% co-investment contribution. It doesn't exempt you from any top-up fees, it's worth pointing out. So again, if you go over that funding band, it doesn't exempt you from that, but it can exempt you from the 5%. So if that's the case for anybody, and you've got less than 50 employees, then you may not end up paying anything, and you might get an incentive as well. So it's nice to be able to deliver some good news, I suppose. That, in a nutshell, is the key elements on the funding element. Did anybody have any questions at that stage?
Hi Shane, just want to jump in there on the
Go for it.
The prior to 1st of April. Sadly, that's now closed. There was a time limit when you had to apply for it, and that ended, I think it was the 31st of May. So you did have a starter before the 1st of April. I think it was from the 1st of September to the 1st of April. That is now closed.
Cool. Thanks, Frank. Obviously, you would still be eligible for the 16 to 18 incentive, etc. It's purely that one around COVID that's closed. So another question I'm quite often asked by employers at the start is what happens if somebody leaves? What happens if somebody needs a break in learning, illness, maternity leave, all of those sorts of things. So these are just some key areas, if you like, and there's pages of the funding rules on this. But if you've got somebody that leaves within 42 days of the start date, they in effect kind of don't count towards the ever starting, if you like. The government go, well, they kind of never started. The government will take any funding that we've received back. We would just need to be careful on how much we've delivered versus any costs we've incurred and obviously not received funding for. However, for anybody that's after the 42 days, that then starts to impact on our achievement rates. So they go down as a withdrawal for us. And Ian spoke a little bit about Ofsted earlier, and it's one of the things that we're measured on. So we look quite closely at our withdrawal rates, because if they are too high or they don't meet the minimum standards, the government can stop us from delivering certain apprenticeships. So it's like a quality assurance, if you like. So it's one of the reasons at the start we do such an in-depth initial assessment to check that people aren't on programs that they're just going to drop out of in 3 or 4 months' time. But from a funding perspective, the funding ceases from the date that they leave. And then again, we would have to look at whether we have received less funding than we've output on costs such as courses. But generally, and I'm I'm not signing the disclaimer here, but generally the funding tracks slightly above how much has been paid out on courses on a linear basis. So it's certainly not something that, in fact, I don't think we have ever done it, Ian, unless you did it before I started, but it's not something we've ever needed to do. And then the final comment I've got on here is around break in learning. So a break in learning is a period where the apprenticeship is in effect paused. And it's generally when a learner is off work due to, for example, maternity or health reasons. And in those scenarios, the funding is suspended. So it's just paused and it resumes when the apprentice comes back. The programme is then replanned with a new end date when that apprentice returns. So they get, in effect, any time that was paused added on to the end, if you like, so they're not disadvantaged. If you're looking at break in learnings, if you've got any apprentices that you think, oh, break in learning is needed, it's worth noting that the government set quite strict rules around what would constitute a break in learning. I'm not going to go through all of those today, but we'll look at them on a case-by-case basis. But it's not just as simple as going, they're not quite ready for an exam, I'm going to pause them for 3 months, because that doesn't fit within the break in learning rules. So that gives you an idea of the funding, it gives you an idea of the levers and the break in learnings, and also the, I suppose, the programme from start to finish at a very high level. I'm now going to move on to looking at the syllabuses and then pass over to Frank. I'm going to start just by briefly touching on the AAT one. Now, this isn't anything I want to spend too long on because it's primarily going to focus on the ICAEW. But for anybody that's looking at that, I suppose, longevity and taking on potentially somebody that starts AAT all the way through to level 7 ICAEW, the syllabus is changing from next year. So anybody that starts this year would be on a current AAT syllabus up until anybody that starts in September, I should say August, September, would be on the current syllabus. Anybody after that would be on the new AQ22 syllabus. And we have run separate webinars, and we'll probably do another one on that as well. They would be studying towards the advanced diploma with the AAT at level 3, and then the professional diploma with level 4. And I'll send these out so you can have a little look at them. But I just thought it's worth noting today around that progression. So you can start somebody potentially at level 3, level 4 AAT, moving on to then level 7, where you would get exemptions from as a result of them completing this. However, what most people are probably here for is information on the ICAEW one. And actually, Frank, this is probably a good time for me to pass over to you, actually, because this is more your area of expertise than mine. Does that work with you?
Yeah, no problem, Shane. I'm happy to talk through this. So, I mean, firstly, what I would say to any employer is you've got the choice of, especially school leaders, you've got school leaders coming in. The AAT is still a really, really good route into the profession. I think it really gives, the students a really good basic understanding of those core skills, bookkeeping, things like that. The only time I really recommend students coming and doing our level 4, our CFAB, which is basically the 6 papers at that certificate level. And again, because that's a separate apprenticeship, there would be an endpoint assessment for that, which means they do a portfolio and reflective examination. The sort of pros and cons of doing AAT, they get the really good grounding. You actually keep them potentially for a bit longer in your employment on their sort of apprenticeship journey. But when they then start the level 7, there are potentially a number of certificate level papers they will need to sit. So again, it's something I would talk to an employer about and ask them to weigh it up. Do they think the student is ready to go onto the ICAEW course, or is it better to put them through the AAT? So it's something, that's a judgment call by employers. But I think it's worthwhile just sort of saying that the AAT can lead into the ACA, and I'll cover that when I show my slides. So, and effectively what you've got there, the certificate level, I say, is a level 4. Students can either start at level 4 or they can go straight on to a level 7, which is the whole ACA. And what you've got there, as Shane's already pointed out, you've got the qualification, which doesn't form part of that apprenticeship as such, but the case study does, and that endpoint assessment. So that is part of the apprenticeship. And as Shane's already pointed out, the endpoint assessment is the sort of final piece. And so far, we've had 100% success rate on that. There isn't anybody who's not passed that. They may have not passed the case study exam, but they have definitely all passed the project report. And that comes down, again, I think, to great tuition from organisations like First Institution. They really will support your student all the way through to that project report. Especially, again, if they're not graduates, if they are school leavers, they probably haven't had that experience of writing what is kind of like a dissertation, a written piece of work, and what is a master's level qualification. So, First Nutrition with their coaches are there to support students through that. A couple of things I will mention that we've introduced in the syllabus this year. At the professional level and at the advanced level, in the audit and assurance and corporate reporting papers, we've actually introduced the use of data analytics software. So there have been a few little technical issues, I'll say, but I'm pleased to say yesterday was Monday was the corporate reporting paper, and it's all been smoothed out. So, and where there were issues, we have supported students. But effectively, what they will do is actually go into a software called Inflow. It's a data analytics software, and they actually use the software to answer a question, as opposed to in the past when students were asked about technology, they had to explain what they would do. Now they just go in on those elements and do it and give the answer in the exam. And to do that, we've introduced a new exam platform. And through that exam platform, we probably are going to look at bringing in new uses of technology across the whole syllabus. So it won't just be those two papers. And again, I think Shane indicated another thing that we've introduced this year is all of the ICAEW learning materials, which are effectively the whole syllabus, are now available digitally. And we don't produce paper copies unless it is for very, very special circumstances. And again, what that means is because they are digital, where there are open book exams, students can basically access those learning materials during the exam. So, we've really tried to advance on that technology. Shane, I think, is there any questions around syllabus? I'm sure everyone, looks at that, they recognise the subjects, so I won't go into the detail of those. But Shane, do you want to talk about the route through that First Intuition takes students through?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So, as Frank's alluded to, there's 3 levels of the ICAEW, and you'll start ultimately at certificate level, work through to professional, and then through to advanced. Our certificate levels, you've got 2 options when it comes to the apprenticeships, and this a lot of the time will depend on the number of exemptions that the apprentice is coming with, and potentially how long they've been in the role for. But you can do certificate level over a 6-month period, so half a year, if you like, or you can extend it out over a year and therefore making it slightly less intense in terms of courses. A general recommendation, and Ian, feel free to chime in here if you want, is that if you've got somebody that is potentially new to accounting, is a school leaver potentially, certificate should probably be done over the year. Otherwise, it is quite an intensive 6 months for them.
And I would just add,
our courses are.
I would just add, if you are taking on school leavers now, particularly, you do need to remember that they've not sat A-levels, they haven't sat exams. So throwing them into professional exams this time round, that's a big ask where their exam kind of history is not complete as it once was. And also what I've seen over the years is, I think, school leavers, and even depending on graduates and depending on what they've done in terms of university, if you're going to start them with ICAEW, potentially do look at spreading that certificate level over 12 months rather than 6. It's on a case-by-case basis, but students aren't what they once were. I know it sounds crazy, but I've witnessed it over the last umpteen years, and I think more and more students possibly are being pushed either because of history and what employers have done in the past, down doing it over 6 to 7 months, whereas they'd have a bit more success and get off to a good start and a more comfortable start if maybe it's spread over a 12-month period. So yeah, that 12-month period I think is going to become more and more an option for students that are starting off.
Cool, thanks, Ian. And our courses across all levels work as classroom-based courses. So certificates traditionally vary between 4 and 6 day course, and then they take a on-demand exam shortly after the course ends. And those can be sat in the centre here. But when they move on to professional level, the format changes slightly. So they still get all of the classroom courses, all of the tuition support, but these are then sat in exam sittings. So learners study 2 exams at professional level at a time, to either the June or the December sitting with the ICAEW. And at this stage, we split our courses into tuition and revision. So they come in initially for the tuition, which teaches them the syllabus. They then get a several-week break, if you like, or gap, where they're expected to continue with self-revision, self-study, going over what was covered in tuition, before returning, usually the week or 2 before the exam window, for a week of revision, which is focused on exam practice, question practice, and getting them ready for sitting the real thing. So that's where there's a slight format change as you move on to professional level. And as I say, those exams aren't, as you probably already know, on demand at that stage. So they have to sit them as prescribed by the ICAEW. When you move on to advanced level, so professional level roughly would take you 18 months if you look at it at 2 at a time. When you then move on to advanced level, you've got 3, if you like, exams with the ICAEW. So you've got corporate reporting and strategic business management, and then the case study. So learners would study corporate reporting and SBM together in one 6-month period. And then they would study case study on its own in the final 6 months, because that also coincides with them needing to complete and submit their project report. So we generally wouldn't recommend anybody doing 3 exams in one go anyway, and certainly not under an apprenticeship when you've also got to do a project report, because it is like having 4 units on the go at a very high level at that stage. So that's why we split that final one out. And again, no structure of the courses is the same as professional level, so tuition and revision. The exam windows are slightly different, being July and November when you get onto advanced level, but beyond that, the principle is the same. Ian, is there anything you would want to add from a course structure perspective before I hand back to Frank?
No, the only other thing I would say is we do offer the ACA CTA joint programme. So in association with Tollies, instead of doing business planning tax, the student can do CTA owner managed business paper, OMB. They can do that first paper of CTA instead of business planning tax. And then once they've finished their ICAEW, they would, and that is taught by myself in Maidstone, but once they've finished their ICAEW, they would then go off and with Tollies, hopefully, but their choice with Tollies, then complete their CTA. So that is another option that we run on that.
And again, just to add that, Ian, good sort of call out for the CTA option, and that can be funded through the apprenticeship as well. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a swap of papers, but it's all under a level 7 apprenticeship. Yes.
Cool. Thank you very much. So at that stage, people might be pleased to know that that's the end of my slides. I'm not going anywhere, but I will hand over to Frank in a minute. Has anybody got any questions for me? I've got one in the chat that I'll reply to in a moment. Anything that people were to ask? Cool. Okay, Frank, then I will allow you to share your slides, and yeah, I'll stop talking for a bit.
So yeah, Shane, if you put up the slides, I was just going to say, I've worked with First Intuition when they sort of started up in London and actually got them set up for ACA training. And it's been great to see not just Maidstone, but the whole of first year tuition across the country really grow. I've always liked them, and caveat, I used to work for BPP myself, but I think first year tuition are just much more student focused. They really do look after their students. And the other thing I'd say, they really look after smaller organisations as well. So they're not, they would love to get more of the bigger organisations, I'm sure, but they really are focused, I think, on employers like you and helping you train. So, big hats off to Ian and the team from that side. Right, yeah, next slide, please, Shane. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about, I think there might be a couple of you on the call who aren't actually ICAEW authorised training employees. I'll quickly go through that. I know there was a couple of other employees who couldn't make this session, so it's being recorded, and I'm going to forward the session on to them. The other thing I always talk about is it's not just about the exams. So there are some other elements of the ACA that students do need to complete. They're not part of the apprenticeship either, so Shane hasn't talked about. I'll then quickly run through the different routes into membership, and then talk about the support really, from that sort of local and regional level, but very much from employer focus, and the support we can give you in recruiting. And then also what's available for students, because there's a lot of support and extra training, and some of that can count towards that off-the-job training that Shane's talked about. So yeah, next slide, please, Shane. So very briefly, talking to anybody who isn't an ICAEW authorised training employer, it is very, very, quick and easy, really. What we have are a set of standards that we would ask any employer to adhere to. And also we look at what is the practical work experience that a student would get while working within an employer. And as long as you meet those criteria, the other thing is we always need a qualified person to oversee the training of students. We do look at that person. They need to be a member of any CCAB, IFAC body. They also need to be up to date with their own CPD. And probably the main one is they can't have any disciplinaries or something hanging over them that would make us think we don't actually want them training our future members. But as long as that's all in place, and I've never actually come across a qualified accountant who we haven't accepted, then complete some good old ICAEW forms, you get a visit from an ICAEW training manager, and that's where they discuss the sort of support that students get from the employer, the work experience they're going to undertake. But effectively, if you are putting students through an apprenticeship, we already know that there is, the support is there. You are investing in that student, and that's how people will then be awarded what we call the ATE status. Thanks, Shane. Next slide, please. So yes, this slide really just sort of covers what is involved in the ACA. In the bottom left-hand corner, that is the exam. So we've covered the exam, so I won't go into the detail in that. But it's not part of the apprenticeship, but students will need to complete through their online training file that every student will get once they've registered with a training employer. They will need to record their practical work experience, which is a minimum of 450 days over at least a 3-year training period. There's also a rigorous ethics and professional skepticism program that they need to go through. And that basically is really teaching them how to behave in an ethical and professional manner within the workplace, as well as outside it. And then you've also got the professional development area. So that's very much like the skills and behaviour section that they do for the apprenticeship. But because, and as Ian and Shane have alluded, the ACA is not mandatory, they still need to do that for the ACA qualification. And it is really key that all employers, when they've got students, they have a 6-monthly catch-up meeting where all of these areas are discussed. And it's recorded on the training file. I won't go into all the details on that. more than happy to go through this with employers once they've got students so they understand what they need to do. But it is really important, if you've got ICAEW students, you are having that 6 months. Next slide, please, Shane. So one of the things, we've kind of touched on this before. So there are lots and lots of different ways to become an ICAEW member. Looking at the left-hand side there, you've got what we call ICAEW CFAB. That is the level 4 apprenticeship. So that was the certificate level, those first 6 exams. You could also come through that level 4 apprenticeship as through the AAT. That would generally give students exemptions from at least 3 papers, and then depending on the options they take at AAT, they can get another 2. Actually, Ian, I don't know if you know this, I don't know what the changes are, how that's going to impact on our exemptions with the new AAT. I've not heard of that yet. Is that something you're aware of?
No, I think that I think because with the 2 tax papers and the audit paper of AAT are pretty much direct swaps under the new syllabus, so I can't see there being any changes to the exemptions. So, yeah. So I think so if they've done the 2 tax papers, they'll get exempt from principles of tax. That's right. If they do assurance, auditing, should I say external auditing of AAT, they'll get exemption from assurance. And what we have had is, for a couple of clients, even though students only need for AAT to do 2 optional papers, they've actually asked for their students to do a 3rd optional paper, just so they get an extra exemption from ICAEW. So that is something that we've been able to incorporate into an apprenticeship program for level 4, doing an additional optional paper, so that when they move on to ICAEW and level 7, they have an extra exemption.
Yeah, and that would effectively mean that at that certificate level, they will only have 1 paper to do, which is the law paper. So it's kind of maximising everything out of the level 4 apprenticeship. And then students who complete the CFAB qualification can actually now get a designation called BFP, Business Finance Professional. So if they don't want to go on to become a fully qualified chartered accountant, they can walk away at that point. And have that sort of category of membership with the institute. That gives them lots and lots of benefits. So they will have access to technical helplines, the library services, private services, those sorts of things. So again, it's something that we are promoting to students who don't want to go on. It's also any ICAEW members out there, if they want extra letters after their name, you can also sign up and get BFP, the BFP designation. And we are asking them to do that, because obviously that then promotes that additional level of membership. And that way, looking at a left-hand route through, once they've completed that sort of level 4, they move on to the ACA qualification proper. And then looking at the right-hand side, you could either then come in literally and start the level 7, as we've already discussed, and go through an apprenticeship route, or the more traditional route of just doing the ACA. But actually over in England now, because the apprenticeship is only available to English students, we probably are seeing around 3/4 of all our students are apprenticeship students these days. Really, the ones who aren't are where employers don't want to give them the time out of the office. And generally, they're more the ones probably in industry, in the banks and places like that, where they want to work them for 5 days and they can only do their studying in the evenings. And there is an additional route in, it's not shown on this slide. It's actually for qualified accountants. Generally in practice, that will be ACCA. Single qualified can't go through this route, but we call it pathways. So that is there for potentially, future partners in chartered firms where you need it to be an ICAEW member within the firm to be a partner. So that is an option as well. So we call that pathways. So there's some of the various routes through into becoming an ICAEW member. Shane, next slide, please. And the final things I just thought I would, highlight the support you actually get from the ICAEW. So within the Kent area in South London, where I am the regional business development manager. So I'm there as a sort of a kind of a first point of contact for either qualified people responsible for training QPRTs, their counsellors, HR, and even students. They've got major sort of questions and they want to talk to me. I will always make myself available. And we're really about, as it says there, making sure we've got a long-term relationship with employers. We're not just sort of trying to get students in. We want to make sure that the students can get through the qualification. They've got all the support they need. So we're there to support them in that. And we will do regular, what we call student inductions. So as I mentioned, students have those other areas, the practical work experience, the ethics, the professional development, and that's recorded on an online training file. So we will do student inductions with them, take them all through that. So if any of you've got students coming up, get in contact with me and I'll definitely set up what at the moment will be a virtual meeting and go through that with them. And again, at that point, I talk about all the resources available to students. Once you're an ICAEW authorised training employer, you will also have appointed you at what we call a training and CPD manager. They are more on the regulatory side, so you get to meet them when they're authorising you, and then they will come back on a 3 to 4 year cycle just to make sure that any employer who is training is keeping up to date with the standards of the ICAEW regarding training. If at that point you haven't got any students, you just go into sort of a bit of a hibernation status, and once you take on another student, they will come back at that point. So they're not, coming in every 3 or 4 years if you haven't got any students. Also there to support you are our regional executives. Hopefully most of you will know those or have had contact with them. But again, they're there for ongoing support for ICAEW members. They will also run sort of regional events. There are ones for people working in business. There are events all run on a regular basis. So again, if you're not involved in those and you want to get involved, please come back to me after the meeting. I'll put you in contact with the people to talk to. And then also, and I'll talk about this in a moment, we have a dedicated student recruitment resource. So people who are out, working with the likes of the University of Kent, London universities, organisations, and even schools now. We're doing a lot of work with schools. We run an event called BASE, where we're going into schools and working with them to promote the accountancy profession. So again, if you are looking to recruit, again, come back to me. We can get you plugged in with the right people to sort of help you. And then we've got the, from a student perspective, we've got the student societies. Again, sadly, a lot of their work would have been, networking events, a lot of them fun, pub quizzes, gala balls, all of those sort of things, but they have been shelved at the moment. And it's unlikely that anything's going to be up and running until, at least the autumn and the wider pandemic. But yeah, it's well worth getting the students plugged into those sorts of events. Next slide, please, Shane. And yeah, I mentioned recruitment support. So the first thing we've got, and hopefully if you are looking to recruit students, we have training vacancies. So that is, as you can see there, an online portal where you can have access to putting on jobs. So once you've set up an account, you can go in there whenever you need to and post any new positions you've got. That is all free of charge. We also have other sort of tools like salary benchmarking. So we always ask students when they register, what is their starting salary? So we collate that each year, and then we produce some statistics on a regional basis so that you can see where you are compared to other sort of organisations. We also have then the university placement programme. So we are doing lots of internships. So mainly with big organisations, I'll be honest with you, but we are, with the work we do with universities, we are able to find interns. And again, that's a great way of finding people. They come back. Sometimes some of the universities, they're actually having like old style sandwich courses. So they're actually looking for someone to have a year's worth of work experience as part of the course. Or we have others who are looking for that sort of 2 or 3 months over the summer. But again, it's a great way of finding people maybe coming back or moving back into your local area, and it's almost a try before you buy in some regards. You can see how they fit into your organisation, and then if they like it, when they finish university, they can come back and I've mentioned sort of the student recruitment team in the previous slide, but as I say, they run the base events. They are still running. Again, they are all virtual at the moment. Another thing there, the available student register, that is actually part qualified students. So as an institute, we try and support employers by not really, going out and getting students to leave midway through their training. So we don't generally support students who leave, but where there may be a situation where the student has lost their job and is out of a training agreement, we will then promote them to employers who are looking on, taking on someone who's got a bit more experience than a straightforward graduate school leaver. Again, and then you've got ICAEW jobs there. ICAEW jobs is the part of our job site aimed at qualified people. So any authorised training employer has access for free recruitment on ICAEW jobs. So if you're ever looking for qualified people, again, you can go on there and push the jobs. Next slide, please, Shane. And then finally, from my point of view, I just wanted to sort of touch on how we support students. So I mentioned I'm trying to make myself available with the student inductions where we talk about everything. But there is, from the ACA point of view, there are lots and lots of exam resources. So make sure your students, when they are studying one of the modules, that they're aware that there are past papers, there's the marking schemes, model answers, the examiner feedback on that, as well as tutor articles. So we try and keep in touch with students. We've got part of the website called Student Insights, and a regular e-newsletter that goes out with that. But within Student Insights, lots of articles. Sure, Ian's probably written a couple himself, and it's where tutors are giving advice on what makes a good exam answer. How do you structure those answers? And it's really good feedback from students if they want to be successful first time through those exams. Your students also get access to all of the faculties online, free of charge. I know some of you will be paying for that, members of the faculty, but they will have access to all of that information for free, as well as a number of the communities as well. They've got access to those. And then, as I mentioned before, part of that off-the-job training, some of these can be used. So we do have a free Excel training course, really sort of an intuitive program that takes students not from the basics, but they do a sort of an IQ test on what they know, then writes a program uniquely for them. So they understand all of that basics, they go straight into the stuff. But definitely things like the finance and the digital world learning modules and the zero cloud accounting training program, they definitely will count as off-the-job training. Finance and digital world is basically looking at new technologies and how that's impacting on the way finance professionals are working. So really good introduction into future technologies. And then finally, you've got CAEW. So CAEW is, as many of you will know, the Chartered Accountants Benevolent Association, and they are really there to support students. A lot of it being, potentially with financial issues they might have, or mindfulness, well-being, mental health issues that might have come up. But it is there. It's there for all our members, all our students, and they do so much, positive work. So, if a student ever has if they're ever struggling in any way, tell them to contact CAEW. I see Ian's just left there, but I think that's everything from me. So, my final slide is basically questions. So open the floor up for Shane and myself to answer any questions you might have.